Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. So last week I give a talk on samatha meditation, and this week I'll cover the other aspect of meditation, of Vipassana meditation. First point I always like to make talking about Vipassana meditation is you should remember that Vipassana is really a way of holding the mind, it's an attitude of mind. It's not a specific practice. People get very attached to specific methods of Vipassana meditation. I heard a story about two brothers, Burmese fellows, and one was a Goyenka follower and one was a Mahasi follower, and they didn't talk to each other for like 20 years. The reason there are these various methods, and most of them come out of Burma. Burma's been very prolific in developing specific meditations. The reason that they're needed is because the state of mind for Vipassana, although it sounds simple, is actually very difficult to access just without any kind of method. Sometimes you hear about people who practice what's called choiceless awareness, which is like trying to do like pure Vipassana. But the problem with that is that without any kind of structure or framework, the mind just becomes sort of fuzzy. And it can feel even sort of good, but feel like you're doing something, but you're not specifically noticing anything, kind of just a fuzzy general awareness. And it doesn't really lead anywhere. You need to find some way of structuring the practice. The state of mind that is Vipassana is well defined or described by that phrase, choiceless awareness. We saw with the samatha meditation, you take an arbitrary object like the breath, and you devote yourself to paying attention only to that object. With Vipassana, you're being aware of whatever the natural processes of body and mind present to consciousness at that moment. So you're not choosing your object. You're just learning to pay attention in the right way to the object that arises. In the right way is important. Seeing something with that clarity and neutrality and precision that's Vipassana is different from analyzing it or trying to figure it out or looking for connections. Shouldn't be doing any of that. You're just present in full awareness of whatever the current object is. And the object can be a wide, even infinite range of possibilities. And it covers both the physical and the mental. In the body, there's sensations in the body. There's sense impressions, like even if you're sitting with the eyes shut, there'll be sound and smell. And mental is even wider range of possible events, every kind of thought, memory, emotional state, auditory or visual nimittas, mind-created objects. It could be any possible thing. And the challenge is always to just be present with that current object and not get carried away by it. For example, beginning with the physical, you can get painful sensations in the body. Either they have an actual physical cause or they're just mentally generated, which is very often the case. And it's challenging to just be aware of painful sensation without getting lost in negative feelings about it and being upset by it and, you know, wondering what to do about it, and what, instead of just noticing this as painful sensation. Likewise with mental objects, objects can arise that have a strong, and they will, this is very common, objects arise that have a strong emotional resonance, like either happy or painful memories, or fears for the future, or anxiety about this or that. And once again, the challenge is just to notice that in the present moment for what it is and not get carried away with either attachment to it, pleasantness of it, or the fear and anxiety of unpleasant things. And one important thing to remember, and a way to deal with these sorts of issues, is that everything is an object. So that if there is some kind of reaction, then the focus should shift to that reaction as the object. If it makes you feel sad, then sadness is what's arising at this moment, and you're aware of sadness. If the mind goes off into thought formations, analyzing or philosophizing about what's going on, then the thought process becomes the object. So you can always step back and look at what's going on as an object, and that's the key. And this is essentially the same, but described from a different angle. It's the same as the Thai forest way of speaking about it, which is to be centered in the knowing, the chitta. This what's going on with thoughts and emotions and feelings and sensations, that's all outside of the chitta, that's known to the chitta. So the chitta is the subject that knows, and the objects are the objective side that is known. And if you get tangled up in the objects, then you're inevitably creating a sense of self. You're taking a perspective, a point of view that's entangled in objects, and you're lost until you can bring yourself back to the just clear noticing. In one sutta, the Buddha talks about classifying thoughts as like sorting pebbles between white and black pebbles. So this is a wholesome thought, this is an unwholesome thought. It's like a man sorting pebbles, white ones in one pile and black ones in the other. And I think you can extend that analogy to sorting aquarium gravel of multiple colors. So that whatever object arises, you know this is a feeling, this is a sensation, this is a thought, this is a memory, this is a worry, and you can put it in the appropriate pile. So particular qualities needed to perform the task of this mindful noticing begin with a wakefulness. You have to be bright, clear, awake to be able to do this effectively. And you need to foster an attitude of equanimity, of neutrality, so that you don't let yourself get thrown or emotionally disturbed by mental events, objects. This is just a thought, this is just a memory, and you maintain this in neutral observing. The specific kind of equanimity that is associated with Vipassana is Tatra Majjhatata. Specific neutrality is the general translation, which is correct, but it's not very literal. The literal translation would be being in the middle about that. The specific part of specific neutrality is that, tatra, because the neutrality is not just a general fuzziness. This is that what I spoke about with the choiceless awareness. It has to be specific, meaning that this object that's presently before my consciousness, I'm to be neutral about that. Yeah. I'm in the middle about that. I'm not swayed to one side or the other, neither to fear or fascination or interest or boredom. The rule to remember is nothing is so trivial it can be ignored, and nothing is so important it needs to be grasped. Everything is treated with exactly the same weight and the same attention. And the attention is very sharp and penetrating, but it's momentary. In one of Mahasi Sayadaw's writings, he uses the analogy of sitting in your car at a crossing and watching a train go by. And you're seeing all these different train cars. There's a coal car, there's a tanker, there's a flatbed, there's a box car, there's a wheat car, but you don't pay any particular attention more to one than the other. You certainly don't get out of your car and start following it down the tracks. You let them go by and you register each one. That's what the mind is doing. Another analogy someone came up with once is shooting wooden ducks at the county fair. These games where you got like a air pistol and these little ducks going by and you shoot them. Each object is like a duck going by and you shoot it, you penetrate its nature. And you don't pay more attention to one than the other. And you don't get fixated on any of them. And you don't ignore any of them. So those remarks are applied to Vipassana in general. I'd like to say something about the Mahasi Method, which is the one that I was trained in. It's the only one that I really know from the inside, so to speak. And not advertising it as saying it's the only method or the best method. No, it's a very good method. It may not be the best method for everybody, but it's a method that has worked for many, many people. It's one of the more popular ones. It was developed by Mahasi Sayadaw. The naming convention in Burmese Buddhism for teachers, he's got also a Pali name that I don't know, I forget what it is. They never use it. He uses Sayadaw as the title. It's like the Ajahn, Sayadaw. And Mahasi is the village that he teaches, where his monastery is located. So he's the Mahasi Sayadaw, and he's known as internationally as Mahasi Sayadaw. The Mahasi method is also called the noting method. You'll hear it referred to as that. And that's because of the particular twist that Mahasi adds to the practice to encourage that specificity, the specific noting of that, to train the mind to be specific. You make a light subliminal mental note of the object, classifying it. So thinking, feeling, remembering, hearing, smelling, right? You make a very light subliminal note of each object as it arises. If you're practicing this way, you have to be careful you don't get obsessed with the noting. Some people become very kind of autistic about the noting, like with what's the correct label? Am I doing this right? But and end up thinking about whether they should call this remembering or speculating, or it's like forget it. Just realize that the noting is very secondary. The important thing is you've actually seen the object. Noticing is just kind of the noting is just kind of a trick you're playing on yourself to make sure you have seen it. You're able to put a label on it. That means you've actually seen it. And it should be just very light and subliminal and almost not there. Just touch it with the mind. And as I said, do not be overly concerned about the correctness of the label. That's not really important. That said, there's maybe some general guidelines for doing it more effectively. One is you should try as far as possible to use verbs rather than nouns. So it's thinking rather than thought, hearing rather than sound. Also, keep the labels brief. Don't make a label into a story. It should be just one or two words. Another thing is that if you find yourself using just a very few labels, try and develop a bit more specificity. For example, the label thinking can get applied to almost any mental event. So you're not really developing a specific noticing if you're just relying on that. So at least one should make a distinction between thoughts of past and future and present, I suppose. But most thoughts will be past or future. So remembering is quite different from speculating or planning or worrying, future-directed thought. Imagining, if you're fantasizing, daydreaming, so imagining or visualizing. Another kind of tip specifically mentioned by Mahasi Sayadaw is if you find yourself caught in some kind of a elaborate daydream, you're following some kind of fantasy through in the mind, which can easily happen. One way to break that up is to start, instead of just saying imagining or daydreaming, to notice specific things in the daydream. So you imagine you're riding in your car on the highway, so driving. You imagine you're getting out of the car, leaving. Try and then make it that object as what's happening in the imagination. And you'll find if you develop some facility with this practice that these kind of thought formations will start to break up. Once they're noticed with this objectivity, you're not feeding them energy anymore. You're not participating. You're just spectating, and they begin to just dissolve. You're not doing it anymore. You're stepping back and just watching it, so you're not feeding it. So that's the kind of general methodology. The specific instructions for practice. There's a specific practice for sitting and also for walking. To do this Mahasi Method sitting, you begin your sit. You don't start immediately with this noting. You begin your sit by watching the breath at the abdomen. And this is explained as the whole bowl of the belly, not a point, because you want to have a broad general awareness of the physical process. You're not trying to develop jhana, so you're not trying to be too focused. You're just noticing the general physical motion of the abdomen. And you rest there, and that's kind of like your home base. And you stay there, noticing that for anywhere from a few breaths to a few minutes until you feel settled. And then you can open the mind to whatever objects arise and go into the noting practice. Done properly, there are no distractions. Everything that arises is an object. So you just continue with that. And any time the mind starts to become empty, there's nothing clear to notice, you want to avoid trying to conjure things up or go hunting for things. If you're not noticing things clearly, just go back to the abdomen and stay there until the mind naturally starts to go out and look at things again. And what will normally happen in the course of a sit is you'll go back and you'll cycle back and forth between periods of time spent on the abdomen and periods of time noticing objects. And it's kind of a natural process you don't force. You let that cycling happen. The walking meditation, instead of using the abdomen as the home base is the sensations on the sole of the feet as you walk. And that's noticed in the phases of lifting, moving, and placing. And there's a mistake that some people make is don't start mentally marking lifting, moving, placing verbally, because then that becomes like a sing-song in your mind. And you actually lose connection to you'll find yourself just going lifting, moving, placing with no connection to the actual steps. But just be aware of the sensation of lifting, moving, and placing. And when you come to the end of the walking path, you stop and you turn around in 3 phases, turning, 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 and then you do the body scan, and then you continue walking again. You do the body scan on the surface of the body from the top of the head to the soles of the feet. So you're grounding your awareness in the soles of the feet again. And anything else that arises while you're walking, you make a note of it. And when the mind gets busy and there's lots to notice, stop walking and just stand still and keep noticing until the mind is quiet again. Then you go back to walking. So you cycle back and forth between walking and standing. And the walking is generally done very slowly. That's kind of a signifier of Mahasi meditators, is you'll see them doing this slow walk, this exaggeratedly slow walking. Ajahn Chah thought that was kind of funny. When he visited IMS, he saw people walking like that. They say he went up to one person, put his hand on his shoulder and said, "I hope you get better soon." I also heard in Mahabua monasteries, one of their practices is when they're doing their duties like washing the bowl or sweeping, they try and do everything extra quick to develop quick, sharp awareness. So I remember one of our monks saying he'd like to see a monastery with a mixed population of Mahabua monks and Mahasi monks that drive each other crazy. So there's many different ways of practice, but the Mahasi method is noted for that slowness. And if you're doing a retreat with Mahasi method, it's recommended to keep the practice going all day. So when you're doing other things like eating or washing up, you continue to note and you do everything slowly as far as you can. I mean, some things you need to be a little quicker, but try and be as slow as you can with your motions so you can notice everything. What should happen with Vipassana meditation is that you start to notice the objects more clearly, and in this detached way, you begin to penetrate their nature. And it's not like a kind of intellectual understanding. It's quite different. You don't necessarily understand things unfolding in some kind of a great logical sequences or philosophical breakthroughs, but you see the actual nature of an object. You're seeing the three characteristics essentially. You begin to perceive the effervescence of things, the impermanence, how quick they rise and fall in the mind. Then you see the dukkha in the unsatisfactory nature, that nothing is really completely satisfying. And ultimately you see the emptiness of it. This is what I find to be one of the most penetrating phrases, succinct phrases in Mahasi Sayadaw's writings. And his writings are brilliant. I'd recommend to look into Mahasi Sayadaw's writings. They're available all over the place. But one of the phrases is, then the meditator comes to see there is only the object, mind arising to the object, and no third besides. So there's only the object, mind knowing the object. There's nobody doing it, nobody knowing. It's just a process, an impersonal process. An object and the knowing of an object. And your Vipassana is going well when you have some taste of that, when it just feels like process you're observing. It can be a very difficult practice, which is one reason why it's highly recommended to develop as much samatha as you can as a grounding, as a basis for taking off from with the Vipassana, because the untrained mind is a very chaotic, messy process, and Vipassana just off the street, so to speak, can be very painful. People experience it as difficult and painful. It's a common thing I've observed since I started teaching. If people come here and they'll do a retreat, and when if they're doing like a week or 2 weeks, and then usually I recommend them do mindfulness of breathing for the first while. Then if they want to switch to Vipassana, to give them instructions in Vipassana. And if they're brand new to Vipassana, and if they're doing it seriously, which some people don't, some people just fool around in their mind. If they're doing it seriously, after 2 or 3 days of Vipassana, then they'll come to me all in distress, and they'll say, "Oh, Ajahn, I think I'm going crazy. I think I'm losing my mind." Try to calm them down and ask them to describe what they're experiencing, and their thoughts are a complete jumble. Their mind is jumping around here and there. One woman had a really good way of describing it. She said, it's like there's a half a dozen radios in my cabin, all tuned to different stations, and they're fading in and out. That's like how her mind felt. And the thing is, as I always tell them, don't worry, your mind's always been like that. You're just now becoming aware of it. You're becoming conscious of it. And if you stay conscious of it, it'll clarify, it'll settle. And you'll begin to see through that confusion. And even if the confusion becomes kind of overwhelming, if you just make a mental note, confusion, That's enough to sort of bring a little point of clarity that you can crystallize around and get cut through it. But that is, that is the nature of the mind. The mind is very quick, and it's moving all the time, and it takes some discipline to be able to observe it and not get caught, not get thrown. There's a million hooks that'll drag you off and say, "Oh, this is really interesting," or "This is scary," or "This is important," and you get thrown off, and you're off your center. There's a whole series of states the mind goes through that's actually been studied extensively. It's called the progress of insight. The germ of this teaching is found in the Majjhima Nikaya in the Relay Coach Sutta, where the Buddha talks about different stages and says that it's like the relay coaches of the king when he wants to send a message. You have fresh horses, they change at different stations and they can gallop very quickly across the kingdom. And he says it's not the purpose of the first stage to get to the second stage. That's not the goal. Second stage gets you to the third stage. That's not the goal. But they are required. Each one is required like a relay stage to get to the end. But in that sutta, he doesn't go into any description. So it's another one of these suttas that are subject to a lot of interpretation because it's just names of stages. The Visuddhimagga, that very important medieval text, the whole book is structured around those stages. That's the framework of the book. Mahasi Sayadaw is probably his most important writing is The Progress of Insight, where he details and goes through these stages because beginning with that kind of scriptural basis and his long experience of meditating and teaching, he's observed many people going through these stages. He's got very good, concise descriptions. What happens to the mind basically is, I'll kind of summarize the stages, is at some point after going through some initial difficulties, the mind often reaches a stage that's called the 10 corruptions of insight. And they're all really good feeling things, the 10 corruptions. They're like seeing bright lights, feeling very joyous, and they have a kind of a jhanic flavor to them as well. And they're corruptions because they're just things the mind's doing, and they're only corruptions if the meditator identifies with them or gets attached to them. And it often happens if someone is new and gets to that stage, they very often think that's enlightenment. It feels because it really can feel really good. But once you see through that and see these things too are all subject to rising and falling, they're impermanent, there's no substance to them, and they're not ultimately satisfying, they're not liberating to the mind, then you reach the stage that's called knowledge of what is path and what is not path. So you actually know what you're doing at that stage, and it's said that only at that stage are you really doing Vipassana. It begins there. Before that, it's just sort of you're just learning or preliminary. And that will take you through some intermediate experiences, and then you get to a series of stages that have names like, and I can't remember the order that they're in, and I don't think it really matters because I think it actually in practice varies, but there's stages like knowledge of fearfulness, knowledge of misery. There's like 3 or 4 of these, and that's equivalent to the dark night of the soul in Christian mysticism. And what's happening is the mind is finally seeing samsara in its ugly reality, in its actual nature. The rose-colored glasses are no longer functioning; they're off, and Okay, here's the body. It's just rotting out from underneath me, and the mind is just a mess of unrelated crap. And there's nothing to rely on, nothing to hold on to, and it can be overwhelming. And some meditators get lost at this point, and they retreat. They don't have the mental fortitude to push through. You know? And the way to get through this is just courageousness, just this kind of warrior ferociousness of just everything sucks, but so what? I'm going to carry on. And you get through to the other side, you reach equanimity about formations. So everything is still impermanent and falling apart and everything else, but you don't care. You're okay with that, right? And this is very important stage, Sankaropeka, the equanimity about formations, because you've now really experiencing this specific neutrality. Whatever arises, it doesn't affect the mind. And there's a sense of no effort being put in. But the meditation is perfect, it's flawless. But you're not trying, it's not difficult. You're just okay with it. You're just sitting there. It's peaceful, very pleasant, not in a joyous way, but just in a peaceful ease of the practice. And that's not yet liberation, but it's the jumping off place. It's the place from which nibbana can be realized. And it's really only from that frame of mind that nibbana can be realized. And there's nothing you can do at that point. You just have to sit there. Visuddhimagga uses the analogy, it's like the sailors in ancient times. They would carry birds in cages on the ship, usually crows, and they call them the land-finding crow. And if they thought they might be getting close to land, they would release the crow. And they would watch which direction it flew off in. It would fly off randomly to the north. And after a time, if it didn't find land, it would come back to the ship. And then it would have a rest, and it would fly out again to the east. And if it didn't find land, it would come back. But eventually it wouldn't come back. Right? It found the other shore. So the mind is like that in equanimity about formations. It keeps jumping out, but it doesn't find the other shore, then it goes back. But eventually it does. It has that potential. As a practical point, and this is something Mahasi brings up, and it's something that is well verified by experience of many people, is that if you get to equanimity about formations, you can't hold it indefinitely. If you don't find the other shore, after a few hours, maybe 4 to 6 hours at the most, you'll lose the equanimity about formations, and you'll fall back to the previous stage, which is marked by a fair bit of restlessness. But if you try and stay still and subdue the restlessness, then you'll get through that fairly quickly and go back into equanimity. So you'll cycle in and out of equanimity with always the possibility when you're in equanimity of realizing the unconditioned. And it's only this practice really that can, not the specific Mahasi practice. I don't want to, proselytize that that's the way, but the practice of insight, of Vipassana in general, is really the way to the realization of the unconditioned. Because you have to understand and completely penetrate the nature of the condition of samsara before the unconditioned becomes possible. It's our ignorance that keeps us locked in samsara. Because we don't understand its nature, we're caught in it, either by allurement of its charms or fear of its horrors, which are the two sides of Mara's game. fascination and fear. And the way to make an end of that, to get out from Mara's thumb, is this being in the middle. I'm neither fearful nor am I fascinated. I'm just present. So I think I'll stop there. Those a few words about the practice of Vipassana.